Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. This one is leading into another difficult week for us because, as you all know, the NVIDIA RTX announcements, the launches, are coming sometime around the 17th and then the 24th for the 3090. That's the official dates out there right now. So leading into that, we have some actually really fun educational topics to go through today in addition to the usual industry coverage. And those include things like researchers exploring embedded liquid cooling. This one is super cool. Really good look from nature.com and from Ars Technica on some of that. There's a Der Bauer Nano-Structure imaging piece on the rise in silicon and really getting into the deeper details with a scanning electron microscope. Xbox Series X and S pricing and availability in standard news, Western Digital and 5400 RPM class drives, and a couple of other things like water blocks for the 3080 and 3090, and a binning story from Igor's lab. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX. The PureBase 500DX is a new push from Be Quiet into mesh-fronted cases that are more thermally focused. The 500DX maintains high build quality and attention to detail for its dust filters, front panel installation, and fan placement, and still has additional focus on noise control. The case comes with three 140mm PureWings 2 fans stock and has RGB LEDs, but with a physical hardware switch for easy control. Learn more about the Be Quiet PureBase 500DX at the link in the description below. So the first story is on Der Bauer's Nano-Structures. That sounded bad. The first story is on imaging Der Bauer's Nano-Structures. That wasn't any better. A fellow YouTuber, Der Bauer, posted a three-part, or actually it's two parts right now, it's working towards a three-part series on some cool stuff that we wanted to bring attention to. So Roman's series uses a scanning electron microscope. He visited a lab to get access to one, and it visualizes the AMD Ryzen silicon nanostructures that are present on specifically a 3950X for this one, where unfortunately there was some sacrifice along the way. The CPU had to be killed to get the imaging of it. But what's happening in the videos is he's magnifying the structures at more than 100,000 times magnification. Roman and the on-site engineer also proceed to go through the images in great detail and talk about the structures comprising the CPU, among other aspects of the silicon. For example, Roman shows just how small the composition of the individual components is. They also zoom in on things like parts of the gates and interconnects within the CPU to really show you what the structure looks like. So it's a very educational series, it's well produced, and we'd strongly recommend visiting Der Bauer on YouTube to visit the series. We'll also link it in our show notes and sources document below, along with all the other stories. He's got versions up in English und auf Deutsch, so you can check that out in either option. But good work. I think he's previously done this with Intel CPUs as well. If you're curious to see the differences between the two, I'm pretty sure he's got some SEM stuff with Intel in the past. Next one, researchers exploring embedded liquid cooling. This is a very interesting story. So even for all of the modern RGB LEDs of computers, believe it or not, there is still room for advancement. It's hard to fathom, but it can be done. Not just with more RGB LEDs, like, for example, RGB LEDs in the IHS, that's what we're really hoping for in Zen 3, but also elsewhere, like the intrinsic inefficiency of cooling systems as they exist today. Despite how good they are for the technology we have, there's a new look at transferring heat into something other than just a standard cold plate and subsequently into the liquid for a liquid cooler that's hosted externally and discretely from the CPU or the component. New research being done in Switzerland seems to show some promising advances in liquid cooling. Primarily, this brings liquid cooling directly to the chip itself via cooling channels directly on top of the chip package. To demonstrate this on a semiconductor, researchers used gallium nitride atop a silicon wafer to build a simple power conversion chip. To build the embedded cooling system, slits are cut into the GaN, or the gallium nitride, reaching down to the silicon beneath. Then those channels are etched at the silicon level to widen them into channels. Then the cuts made through the GaN are sealed with copper. Water flows through the channels underneath the silicon via feeds and sinks. The researchers also packaged this cooling system by using a double-sided adhesive with a laser cut channel to accommodate the chip's cooling. And the entire package was affixed to a PCB with connections for both power and water supply. Overall, the researchers noted that the design is able to handle heat loads up to 1700 watts per square centimeter while keeping the chip temperature from rising beyond 60 degrees Celsius. While adapting this system to modern processors in silicon would be far more complicated. It's promising research nonetheless. And again, we're pushing these two stories to the front of the news video because if you're more into understanding the hardware or the research side of it or the education side of it, these are kind of just fun technology things to read other than the usual product stories. Speaking of usual product stories though, AMD's big Navi and Zen 3 announcements are set for October. AMD finally made it clear when we'd be able to see Zen 3, not to be confused with Ryzen 3000 to be clear, and the RDNA 2 big Navi parts by announcing its future announcement, which is a trend now. NVIDIA spent 21 days doing it, and Asus decided to follow by also announcing a countdown timer to follow NVIDIA's countdown timer by about 1 day. But anyway, that's the trend. So the RDNA 2 announcement and the Zen 3 announcements are coming up. AMD basically said it's going to reveal its Ryzen 4000 Vermeer codename CPUs based on Zen 3 and RDNA 2 based GPUs on October 8th and 28th respectively. This is going to mark the sort of the end of the initial trajectory for Ryzen as it was first disclosed in 2017 when it was getting its initial rounds with Ryzen 1. Back then, AMD did a sort of a roadmap at the beginning for Zen 1, 2, and 3. There was a Zen Plus half step in there that we all got as well with the Ryzen 2000 series CPUs, and that's 2000 in the name, not Zen 2. Once again, that's Zen Plus architecture. So now it's closing that initial trilogy for the storyline for AMD's 2017 announcements about 3 years later. And at this point, we're going to be moving forward into new stuff that wasn't discussed at all back when the first Ryzen was launched. So big changes potentially coming after that. But these types of announcements typically predate product availability by at least a little bit. It's possible that AMD is going to do availability at announcement, depending on supply, how confident it is, things like that. But generally speaking, you do see the announcements a little before launch, just like we did with NVIDIA recently and Intel after that. If this gets announced first and it's available later, AMD would need to hit the Black Friday buying window ideally to maximize impact. But it's also splitting silicon for consoles and CPUs, since so much of what AMD is presently making is on the same wafer supply. AMD will have to figure out how to split the limited supply between its products. Consoles will have purchase orders that probably can't be changed on the fly, especially with anticipated high volume. But the consoles are really important for AMD because they provide a lot of much needed and very predictable and stable cash flow where you have two massive vendors, Microsoft and Sony, committing to, at this point, proven purchases for products. It's not like they have an unknown vendor they're working with here. These are both proven product lines. So that's one end of it. CPUs on the other end, AMD's got a really brilliant setup that it introduced with Ryzen, with the Zen architecture, where because it's broken into chiplets and the silicon is smaller per piece of silicon on the substrate, AMD's able to reduce the die size, increase the yields, and in theory, improve its margin at a given area of the wafer that's cut into the product being sold. So all of this means that with GPUs, if the silicon's larger, which it should be at least for now until we get into MCMs for GPUs at some point, if the silicon's larger, there's potentially a lower yield, but TSMC's yields, as they've published recently, are extremely good for 7 nanometer now. It's a pretty mature process these days, but there's still a risk of potentially lower yield. There's an opportunity cost of splitting parts over to GPU land when potentially CPUs are maybe in more demand or consoles are in more demand. So we'll see how it shapes up. This is one of the advantages and disadvantages of working with a third-party fab. The advantage is AMD is working with, at this point, a leading technology producer in the world and isn't going to get stuck in the same way Intel has gotten stuck on its own process advancement. The disadvantage is obviously that Intel, if it needs to, can shift things and move stuff around to free up fab space for one part or another because it controls the entire fab, whereas AMD is going to be given a fixed amount of supply because there's other customers too, like Apple, for example, with TSMC. Anyway, previously there was an Easter egg in Fortnite that suggested new GPUs would be called the RX 6000 series. This is actually a pretty cool way to do a pre-announcement tease, and it's product teasers done right, we think, as opposed to the sort of tweets that you typically see from AMD. So that was cool to see. We'll pay more attention to that stuff as it approaches, obviously. Hopefully they can get some more integrations like that that are actually related to the product that's going to be sold. Obviously, we'll have to wait and see how exactly AMD is going to position its GPUs. There's plenty of precedent for last-minute price cuts or changes between both AMD and NVIDIA. NVIDIA happens to have its RTX 3070 card launching in October. Currently, the rumblings in the industry from board partners is first half of October for at least review upload scheduling, but that's so far away at this point that it could definitely change. That said, NVIDIA probably wants to preempt the RDNA 2 announcement to get cards out to as many people as it can, so that would make sense if they stuck with it. So we'll keep following it as it advances. Zen 3 is probably going to be one of the most interesting products to cover in the end of the year, though. All right, Xbox Series X and S pricing and the promising SOCs in them. After a leak that claimed a $300 price tag for the then unconfirmed Xbox Series S, Microsoft came out and confirmed both the console and the price officially. Microsoft also announced that the Xbox Series X would be priced at $500 and that both consoles will be available on November 10th. Alongside the new consoles, Microsoft is rolling out a revamped Game Pass Ultimate subscription that comes with an EA Play subscription at no additional cost, as well as financing options for purchasing the new consoles. Hardware-wise, in some aspects, the Xbox Series S isn't too different from the larger Xbox Series X, but there are some important changes. Unsurprisingly, the biggest changes come in the form of a pared-down GPU, less GDDR6 memory, and less solid-state storage. The Series S uses a 7nm 8-core Zen 2 SoC, but is offset with a slightly lower CPU clock speed. Meanwhile, the GPU runs at 1.56 GHz across 20 CUs. That is compared to 52 CUs, or compute units in AMD's terminology, clocked at 1.82 GHz for the Series X. This is definitely one of the largest differences between the two, and it's probably the driving factor for the price. So when you start talking about CU differences this large, frequency gaps this large in PC land, that would amount to a drastic reduction in your expected performance out of a given video card. At this point, you're changing resolutions down a tier, you're dropping graphics down a tier or two, so that's a pretty big change. But in consoles, you have to keep in mind that there are sort of interesting implications where, one, there's an implication with the xCloud, which we'll talk about in a second, but two, consoles are mostly just one or two sets of hardware, and they're all pretty much architected on the same overall platform, even if the CU count's changing. So developers don't have to worry about building for millions of configurations of computer, and there's a better option or a better chance that they're able to optimize to a point where you can make a 20 CU slower part, still produce fairly good graphics. It is going to complicate things, though, just how big that gap is, but the pricing differential is probably necessary at this point. The xCloud implication is the other one that's interesting. So if Microsoft is sort of intending to effectively ship a massively overpowered Chromecast type device that can still do stuff locally, it could tie into xCloud for the more demanding games and stream them to the device, much like we're seeing with Stadia, except xCloud has had a bit more of a focused rollout lately. This is all doubly true when considering that Game Pass Ultimate is getting additional marketing behind it lately. So it looks like it might be gearing up for sort of a 20 CU version that can do some gaming locally and tap into xCloud for remote processing of more demanding titles, which would be very interesting for the implications of gaming. Now, in some regions, this just won't work at all, depending on your internet availability there, the bandwidth options. But in others with faster internet connections, it may be doable if the latency can be kept to, say, below 100 milliseconds on average. So the Xbox Series S is targeting a claimed 4 teraflops of compute, and the X is targeting 12.15. This number, you can't really just do it's 3 times more powerful because of the optimization items discussed. It's not necessarily a linear change, but even with a marketing number, that still provides some sense of scope. So for other claims, the Series S is primarily aimed at 1440p and supposedly 120 FPS gaming. It looks to be positioned as a successor to the Xbox One S. These names are why Sony's killing it right now. Change the number by 1 digit, easy. So while all eyes are squarely on Sony now, there's already been a rumor that suggests the PS5 hardware was priced a bit more exorbitantly than Microsoft's. According to that rumor, if we're going to believe it. Sony is now likely looking to match prices with Microsoft. Cool thing with rumors, this is probably something anyone could speculate. So I mean, that would make sense. Anyway, the AMD console GPUs do look promising this generation. We're excited to do some teardown on the consoles and try and do some testing, see how they perform, and see if maybe we can sort of match them to an equivalent on PC. And the most interesting aspect of this would be to do a game-for-game comparison, PC to console. All right, Western Digital's 5400 RPM class designation that it has introduced recently. Western Digital seems keen on attracting yet more ire from customers after dealing with the controversy regarding advertising previously for all the companies. This time it's about the WD red line of NAS hard drives and the spindle speeds. According to Ars Technica and its write-up, this issue actually came to light around a year ago via the German hardware site hardwarelux.de, but it's only been lit aflame in earnest thanks to a post on Data Hoarder. The crux of this issue is Western Digital identifying certain WD red hard drives as, quote, 5400 RPM class, despite evidence that the hard drives actually spin at 7200 RPM. Additionally, the 5400 RPM class designation doesn't seem to be limited to just WD Reds, but also certain models from the My Elements and the My Book product lines. However, the 5400 RPM class issues do seem to only affect 8TB models. Again, this issue isn't entirely new. Another user previously posted findings with the WD Elements WD80 EMAZ model and the WD My Book WD80 EZ AZ models. Not only are the hard drives being advertised as 5400 RPM models, but the firmware also reports a spindle speed of 5400 RPM. User findings are allegedly contradicting that. Quote, last year I bought a few of the drives myself, and then lists the models. When someone on a German forum told me that they were actually 7200 RPM, I didn't believe them at first either. But then I took a microphone and started measuring. You can see 7200 RPM is equal to 120 rotations per second, which should manifest as a base frequency of 120 Hertz, plus maybe integer multiples of that frequency, so-called overtones or harmonics, and then lists 240, 360, and so on. 5400 RPM, on the other hand, corresponds to 90 Hertz. Therefore, it should be easy to tell the difference between the two, end quote. This conclusion by the user was come to after a quick frequency analysis on the hard drives, whereby the hard drives were placed on a cardboard box with a Yeti mic positioned above them, and recording of the drives was done while they were powered on. Spectral views were then captured with Adobe Audition, which showed a baseline frequency of 120 Hertz. There have also been reports of affected drives receiving complaints regarding noise and temperature, which would stem from the drives not being actually 5400 RPM drives. A primary reason some of the users prefer 5400 RPM drives is lower noise and operating temperatures. Ars Technica reached out to Western Digital for comment, and we've got their story linked in the show notes document below if this interests you for further reading, and received a statement that says, quote, Western Digital has published RPM speeds within a class or performance class for numerous years rather than publishing specific spindle speeds. WD writes, we also fine-tune select hard drive platforms and the related hard drive characteristics to create several different variations of such platforms to meet different market or application needs. By doing so, we are able to leverage our economies of scale and pass along those savings to our customer. WD asserts also in its reply that it includes power, acoustic, performance like data transfer, and other performance metrics on its hard drive advertising, and sort of stops there. So basically the response is, we gave you everything you needed to know what it was. Up next, RTX 3090 and 3080 water block servicing. When NVIDIA showed off its RTX 3000 series cards, the company boasted about its new flow-through design. Surely you've all seen it at this point. And that has the sort of subsequent effect of having a very strange PCB to try and attach a water block to, but one which could potentially look really cool and also be a small PCB. And the further downside of being potentially a difficult device to disassemble, but we'll find that out soon. We haven't actually taken it apart yet. We'll find that out soon in our content once we're able to post it. So then, the water blocks coming out, there's a couple of options here. There's a traditional reference design that board partners will get, and then there's also the FE design. In the past, this has sort of been true to some extent, where both AMD and NVIDIA in recent years, like with the 5600 series, for example, would release a set of reference cards to partners where they might have multiple options, and that's why sometimes you'll see boards at launch that all look the same from the various partners, but with different cooling solutions. So even if it looks different from the reference, the true reference design, as we often call it, from the company selling the GPU. This time, though, Founders Edition does actually have a specific, unique meaning. It's not really accurate to fully call it just a reference card anymore. I personally keep doing that out of habit, but technically speaking, the Founders Edition isn't really a reference card anymore. It's going to be a hard habit to break, because we were calling it reference because we didn't want to call it Founders Edition because it was weird at the time to do that. So anyway, though, there have been some EKWB blocks that have been shown. Bikeski also seems to have produced water blocks that are compatible with the PCB produced for the FE cards, that weird shaped triangular one on the end. And that will be for the 3090 and the 3080 FE cards, at least as of now. The blocks are listed over at Easy Modding, and they come in different finishes. That's acrylic, acetal, etc., the usual listing of materials. And they're stated to be full coverage blocks for the cards, so they should contact the memory and the VRM as well. Finally, these blocks appear to be available for pre-order, with Easy Modding also having placeholders for upcoming AIB models. Generally speaking, we'd recommend maybe waiting till at least there's some more official announcements out there, just to make sure you're actually getting something that's going to be made immediately and not some indeterminate date in the future. But there are going to be water blocks from just about everyone. Watercool is working on some as well, of course. AlphaCool, just about everyone's got stuff on the way. Cryorig up next with its new R5 cooler. We've been talking about the potential return of Cryorig, at least to the US market, for some time now. And most recently, that was with its product announcement, where it just said something was coming 500N. We never figured out what that meant. Some of you told us that it was some form of language called 1337 speak, and we couldn't figure out what that spelled either, way over our heads. But whatever it was, it looks like now it's materialized, and that's going to be in the R5 cooler. The R5 cooler is supposed to be a CPU tower cooler with dual fans. It has some interesting features and claims, such as a, quote, quick mount system that supposedly allows for one-handed installation, so you don't need 7 hands like with some coolers, like the Liquid Freezer 2, for example, on AMD platforms. The R5 uses 6 heat pipes. It comes with a TDP rating by their measurement of 200 watts, and Cryorig hasn't mentioned many technical details on how the mounting system works, but we actually covered a system like this a couple years ago at Computex. It's been so long that who knows if this is actually the same one we saw. We'll have to actually get it in to check. But if you're curious about it, we do have some coverage. You could probably search the channel for Cryorig Computex and it'll come up. You'll see how it worked then. Additionally, Cryorig listed a front fin density of 48. It noted a front fin measurement of T equals 0.4 millimeters and then the gap of 2 millimeters. And Cryorig also announced its new, is that the name? That's really the name. Announced its new Crona RGB fans. Hopefully I said that clearly enough and enunciated it enough that YouTube won't tag this with that box under the video. So that's Crona, not to be confused with the other one. Anyway, at any rate, the Crona, gonna really enunciate that word when I say it, RGB fans are 120 mil fans that feature a circular RGB LED design. This has become popular in recent years, and it uses Cryorig's HPLN, or what they're calling a high precision, low noise bearing design. Price and availability still ETA, but we're interested to see Cryorig come back to the market. It's been a little while since they've had some new stuff. Finally, RTX 3090 and 3080 binning stories from Igor's lab. Igor's lab suggests that the quality of the upcoming RTX 3000 chips may be a bit scattered. If it wasn't already clear, Igor has a clear pulse on the GPU industry and the market, and he recently nailed the RTX 3000 launch several months in advance. So the information is likely reliable given Igor's recent history of nailing the details. Getting into some specifics, both the upcoming RTX 3090 and 3080 will make use of the GA102 die, which itself is based on a custom adaptation of Samsung's 8nm process. This much is known and official from NVIDIA. NVIDIA calls it 8N. Regardless of node maturity, the GA102 is large and complex, and as ever, it'll take some time to fine-tune the manufacturing to extract the best chips. That said, Igor's lab is reporting some binning statistics for some initial production of GA102-based chips for the RTX 3080, sorted into bin 0 for average, bin 1 for good, and bin 2 for really good. The early chips seem to skew towards bin 1. reportedly accounting for a 60% average. Another 30% make up bin 0, and 10% make up the bin 2 for GA102. Igor's sources here claim that they haven't received as much information on the RTX 3090 chips and models. So overall, the expectation is that the bin assortment will look similar to the 3080, and the data suggests that currently Samsung's custom 8nm process for NVIDIA is looking healthy. So most users stand a good chance, if these numbers are accurate, of getting a bin 1 chip by this rating. Igor is citing undisclosed sources at vendors and board partners for these numbers, but again, Igor's got a pretty good track record for this type of information lately, especially with the RTX launch, and we work with undisclosed sources at board partners all the time as well, and typically it's pretty good information. So igorslab.de, if you want to check out that story, would generally recommend checking out his site. Igor does some great work. He used to run or work for Tom's Hardware DE, split off and does his own thing now. And he's got a YouTube channel too. He started up just recently. I think recently got into the tens of thousands of subscribers. So check him out if you're not aware of him. And he's got German and English videos as well. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net or patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out directly. Check back and watch our GPU methodology piece. If you haven't already seen it, it might be on the channel already. We have some cool Schlieren imaging technology in there, and we also have some 3D imaging and of pressure scans for GPUs coming up. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.